I really think ultimately this is about how we come to make choices as a society, as a global society.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore some of the less explored aspects of conservation and the environment and question some of the more questionable conventional wisdom in this field. I'm your host, Andre Mado. Even the greenest cities are characterized by replacing nature with concrete, glass, and asphalt, and their footprint extends far beyond their boundaries to provide for the needs of the thousands, millions, or tens of millions of people concentrated within them. They're home to most of the people on Earth now, and they're the source of most pollution. But it seems that cities are also an inevitable result of the development of civilization. They continue to grow in size and in number, especially in some of the most biodiverse and pristine parts of the planet. So does that mean that they're a fundamental obstacle to conservation? Should conservationists be trying to de-urbanize? My guest for this episode of the Case for Conservation podcast answers these questions with an emphatic no. Eric Sanderson's background is in landscape ecology, and he's a senior conservation ecologist at the Wildlife Conservation Society based at the Bronx Zoo in New York. He's authored more than 100 peer-reviewed papers and other publications on a wide variety of conservation topics. These include 2 books, one of which, Mannahatta, A Natural History of New York City, was a New York Times bestseller when it was published in 2009. Another of his publications was a bioscience article in 2018 that talks about why cities have such a crucial role to play in conservation. And it's this article that forms the basis of our discussion. I started by asking Eric to explain a couple of terms that set the scene in that paper. One is the Anthropocene, and the other, the Great Acceleration.
We're living at a time of dramatic change on the planet in both the human sphere and the way that human beings interact with the environment, and then back again on the way the environment's changing and how it impacts on people. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of different ways of conceiving this. One of them is in terms of geologic time. Geologists tend to break up these long periods of Earth time by looking at dramatic events in Earth history, and then they give these names which are more familiar to geologists than they are to the rest of us. The Cambrian era, which, represents this time when there was a massive fluorescence of evolution around 540 million years ago, or the Cretaceous period, which ended with the asteroid hitting the Earth 65 million years ago and took out the dinosaurs, or the Pleistocene, which is sort of, the classic ice age, 2.5 million years ago to the last, 11,000 years ago, when you had these repeated glaciations that were reshaping the Earth and the climate and all the living things on the planet. Mm-hmm. We're living in what geologists have traditionally thought of as the Holocene, which is the last sort of 11,000, 12,000 years, which is an interglacial period of somewhat warmer temperatures, of a more stable climate, the climate that we used to think of before we started talking about climate change all the time. Mm-hmm. And what some geologists have suggested, geologists, atmospheric chemists, biologists, it's not officially accepted, but maybe there's a new geologic era that's just the last couple hundred years, which is this idea of the Anthropocene, wherein the most important geological factor, the most important environmental factor are people. And that's not true for any other of the events before. They were all driven by, either astronomical events or, geological events. But this one is really driven by a biological event. And people argue about when you might start the Anthropocene. Is it the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago? Is it agriculture 12,000 years ago, the development of agriculture? Is it the end of World War II and the use of nuclear weapons for the first time? Mm-hmm. But whatever you use to be the marker, I think this idea that human beings have become such a dominant impact, on the planet is a really important idea to understand our time. And it's related to this other concept that's called the Great Acceleration. Mm-hmm. Which has been developed by Will Steffen, who's a kind of atmospheric chemist, but important in the climate change circles, and picked up by the environmental historian William McNeill, which is the idea that if you just plot the data about how the socioeconomic system has changed since 1950 on Earth, and how the environmental system, the natural systems of the planet have changed, you see these curves that have a dramatically similar shape, which is that they're relatively low and then the rates increase so dramatically. over the last, 70 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
What's important about that is, of course, that's the world that you and I live in. That's the world we all live in. And that's really the only world we've known. But it's a world that is just dramatically different than any other version of the Earth here, before it. Mm-hmm. And I would argue probably very different from any version of the Earth that comes after it.
Mm-hmm. So the Great Acceleration, you said about 70 years. So that's roughly since World War II, right? Since the end of World War II.
That's right.
Why would it be then, rather than the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that would be regarded as a great acceleration, like a real change in pace?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I think it's sort of the emergence of a global world order. Despite the Cold War was mostly a peaceable time, we haven't had a third world war, at least yet. Mm-hmm. It's the rise of globalization and the rise of rapid technological change. All of these things which, spread medicine around the world, that's helped trigger it. It's the beginning of kind of rapid urbanization and the development of megacities around the world. Mm-hmm. And it's a time of just massive, massive economic growth, driven largely by fossil fuel consumption, in my view. And the combination of those things and which one leads the other is something I think we could, kind of discuss infinitely. But I think the point of the idea of the Great Acceleration is it's all these things at the same time, mm-hmm. and that the curves are massive. Like the world population in 1950 was around 2.5 billion people. Mm-hmm. It's creeping up on 8 billion people today. So what is that? That's like a threefold increase in 70 years, 3 times more people on the face of the planet. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, consumption has also gone up. If you look at the size of GDP and you can control for inflation, around 1950 or 1960, it was about $11 trillion. Mm-hmm. Last year, it was pushing $87 trillion. So an 8-fold increase over that period of time. Energy consumption since 1980 is up 4-fold than in the periods before. So, Stefan has a couple of papers about this. It's fertilizer consumption, it's paper production, it's international travel. And then on the Earth system side, it's carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. It's, surface temperatures, it's ocean acidification, it's loss of tropical forest, the exploitation of the marine resources. It's not that these things weren't happening before. They were happening before. They're just happening at much slower rates. Right. And then the rates have just, been accelerating upward in kind of like a kind of inverse J kind of shape. Mm-hmm. And it's these trends are so global that I think all of us who are alive today just sort of think of them as normal because that's what we've experienced in our life. But in fact, it's not really normal in the history of humanity. Would it not have been normal at all for our grandparents? Mm-hmm. And I would argue it's probably not going to be the same world of our grandkids. And the difference, the world that our grandkids live in depends a lot on the decisions we make in our world today. Right. Which is why we wrote this paper about the bottleneck and the breakthrough. Mm-hmm.
So when you say great acceleration, it's an acceleration of all sorts of things, including various impacts and other things, not just the impacts, but all the stats behind those impacts as well, the drivers right. and everything. Mm-hmm.
It shows how well connected the human systems are, our sort of socioeconomic systems are to mm-hmm. the natural systems. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we're in a period of massive feedbacks where, of course, now the climate system is changing so much that it's really impacting the socioeconomic system in important ways. Biodiversity change is arguably the same sort of thing. And in general, I think like the availability of natural resources into the future is really going to be a huge driver of political and social and economic disruption mm-hmm. in ways, again, that we have difficulty anticipating in our world today.
Right. Until an example comes along, right? Like the Russia-Ukraine situation, right? And then suddenly everyone is focused on it, but only on that very specific aspect of things. And there's the specific resources that are involved there.
That's right. Well, and, something that Stefan doesn't write about, but I think a lot about in my life is how there's also a psychological acceleration. Mm-hmm. Not only is the world changing faster than it has done before, but the pressures on the world are changing faster in a way that's kind of bewildering. I think it's bewildering for all of us, kind of regardless of where you live and regardless of your sort of political dispositions. And it tends to get expressed into the political system. And people like, well, we have to do this and we have to do that and we need to change this. But a lot of times the political systems that we have devised both over the last, say, 200 years, but also over the last 50 years, really don't seem to be up to the task of dealing with the current moment. And having this sort of long-term perspective that I think we need our institutions to have. And I think not just our institutions, but our populace needs to have in order to work together more cooperatively toward a better world for the future.
Eric, you spoke quite a bit about population, and in the paper you talk about 3 global trends relevant to conservation, of which the first is the end of population growth. And I think that's something that I have read up a bit on myself, so it's familiar to me, but it might sound alien to a lot of people. I think it's really only gradually making its way into the mainstream, this idea that the rate of population is actually slowing.
Right. So this idea about how population growth might come to an end or how the global population might stabilize and maybe even go down someday is an implication of what's called demographic transition theory, which is to say that if you look at societies over the very long term, they move through a series of stages. This is the kind of thing that gets touched on in the United States, in the 4th grade, and then sort of people never sort of come back to it again. But I think it's just so important, so fundamental. And basically it's the idea of what is the balance of the birth rate and the death rate in an area, which could be the whole planet, if you think about it, or it can be in a country or a subset of a country. But, in sort of pre-industrial times, both the death rate and the birth rate tended to be very high across the board in societies,
right.
And mostly through infant mortality. So this is little kids, dying. And there's all kinds of social conventions around this. Why do kids get a baptism name, a few months after they're born? Well, it's because you want to make sure that they actually survive that long because there was such high mortality. And because there was such high mortality in the past, people tend to have bigger families, right? To try and compensate. So sort of compensatory fertility. But basically the idea that maybe your family conceives, 5 children over the course of the lifetime, but only 1 or 2 will survive. And this was the fate of the whole world. And it's really very hard to sort of contemplate that for thousands and thousands of years, that's what human society was like. And
that was the norm, yeah.
And that was the norm. And so a consequence of that is human population was really, really quite low. And it took a very, very long time, even after the agricultural revolution, to grow. And then something changed. And that something changed is the development of modern medicine, or at least the ideas that led to the modern medicine, starting in Europe in the late 18th century and leading into the 19th century. And once we start, once people actually started to do sort of scientific medicine, actually look what's going on in the body, think about the reasons why people die, the disease agents, the recognition of viruses and bacteria, the importance of public sanitation and health, and the role of polluted water and spreading diseases. Once people started to get an idea about these things and started to address them, then the mortality rates went down, but the birth rate stayed high. So you get this period where the population really starts to grow, and you see it first in Europe, and then you see it happening in the Americas, and then you see it sort of spreading around the world at different points in time. But the same process is sort of happening, which is, medicine is bringing down mortality, but people still have these customs of having large families. And so the population really grows. And so you have this period of relatively rapid population growth. And depending when that happens in history and sort of the availabilities, the political and social space, that gets resolved in various ways. I mean, the big immigration waves from Europe into the United States, for example, where I live in the middle of the 19th and the end of the 19th century, are largely driven by the demographic transitioning playing out in Europe. That's the sort of release valve.
So you mean because the sudden increase in population meant that there were too many people and too few jobs, that kind of thing?
That kind of thing. People move, a lot of people started moving to cities. It's happening at the same time as there's big changes in the way lands are being managed as well. For example, in England, the enclosure movement and things, it's kicking people off the land and moving it to the cities. Demographers, and historians aren't divided about the push and the pull factors relative to things like urbanization. But I think the point at this point in the conversation is the population is growing rapidly. And where are those people going to live? Every person who's alive wants the best thing for themselves. So what are they going to do? And some immigrated. And, at that time in the 19th century, for European immigrants, the United States was open to that. And so people came here. And that's how my ancestors, left Hungary and left England and left Norway and left Ireland and ended up eventually, meeting each other in America and making me, That's, a huge part of American history is this wave of immigration. It's the thing that made New York City. New York City at the beginning of the 19th century had about 40,000 people. By the end of the 19th century, it had over 2 million people. Just remarkable numbers, remarkable expansion of the population. Anyway, but that's all just one part. That's just like stage 2 of the demographic transition. Stage 3 is after a while, the birth rates also start to go down for a whole complicated set of reasons related to people being able to make more choices about their fertility, their lives, particularly women. Urbanization, that enables women to have other kinds of occupations and delay the time of first reproduction leads to lower birth rates. Eventually, what happens is in the 4th stage of the demographic transition, those two numbers came back to each other. The birth rate and the death rate become more similar and about the same. Right. Now you're often at a much higher level of population, but you're getting to stabilization. Yeah. And in terms of trends like the Great Acceleration that we talked about before, that sort of peaking of the world population growth occurred in the 1960s. The actual increase in the rate of population growth peaked in the 1960s, and it's been very slowly coming down.
At the global level.
At the global level.
The peak was in the 60s.
That's right. The population is still growing, but the rate of population growth is going down. And, it varies from place to place. And we've, to this point in the conversation, been talking about global trends. And it really is important to sort of unpack them and think about them, what they mean for different regions, different groups of people at different points in time. They all mean different things, but because they mean different things doesn't mean that the overall trends aren't also happening.
Right.
That you see this trend playing out in Europe. It's happening now in the Americas, and now it's happening in East Asia and China and Japan, and in lesser extent in India and Southeast Asia, but it's all on the same trajectory. And eventually it will, it started in sub-Saharan Africa as well, and I think it'll continue there as well. And then once all the big parts of the world are through the process, then we will be at a point where the population will not be growing anymore. And then it's kind of a guessing game because now we're talking about a time that's, 40 or 50 years from now to 100 years from now. And what happens after that is also a big question. It depends on a lot of the assumptions you make. If you look at the long-term forecasts of the UN population division, they assume that we get to 2100 and the birth rate and the death rate become equal to each other. Essentially, we get at stationarity and the population will just stay as it is. And so therefore they get these projections of a world population that is kind of, forever at 9 or 10 billion people. But if you just tweak those numbers a little bit, if you put the birth rate up a little bit higher than the death rate, then the population starts growing again. And you get to, some very large number, 15, 18 billion people by 2300. But if you take it down a little bit, the birth rate's a little bit lower than the death rate, then you could even imagine a world that by 2300 is 2 billion people as opposed to 8 or 10 billion people. Which is all just to say, it's speculative. Like, we don't know what that future is going to be, but because population is this compounding phenomenon, it's not just about what happens now, it's about what happens now that has an effect into the future. That small changes today can make really big differences in the long run number of people on Earth.
And then as far as I understand, that 9 or 10 billion is kind of roughly the best guess that the UN has been able to make at this stage, based on what has already happened in certain countries in the world, the sort of trends that are happening. And that brings us to the second of the global trends that you talk about, which is the end of poverty. Can you just sort of explain that and how that's related to the population growth side of things?
Right. Well, and it's really important for the impact on the environment as well. Because, impact on the environment isn't just population, nor is it just consumption. It's really the multiplication of those two numbers, right? It's, how many people are in the world and then how much are they consuming? And consumption rates are very different for different people in different situations, and then the population is different in different places. So just to say that I think this is a little piece that's missing out of Stephan's argument around the Great Acceleration, which is that the impacts on the environment are really population times consumption. And so you need to think about that at both times. So to your question around poverty, we've been talking about how consumption's been increasing and the GDP's been increasing. In popular discourse, often that leads to a discussion about inequity and how people at the top are doing so well, and that is true. Like the very richest of the world, the top 1% or the top 10 to 1% of their wealth has grown fantastically over the same period over the last 70 years. What's less appreciated, except among poverty experts, is that poverty has really plummeted on a global scale. Even as the population has been growing, poverty on a percentage basis has been declining. So much so that in 2011, the World Bank reset the level of what extreme poverty meant. When I talk about poverty and wealth, of course, it's a spectrum, right? It's not; these aren't absolute states. It's all relative to something. And so, how much money you need to be extremely poor is a kind of statistical decision or statistical kind of artifact. But despite these things, the number of extremely poor people, the people that basically have to make their living through direct subsistence by getting their own resources out of the environment, getting their own water, have to grow their own food. That was, in pre-industrial times, that was 98% of the population. Now it's between 600 and 800 million people globally, on a base of 8 billion people. It's declining to less than 10% of the population. And some people think that, eventually it could go away. In the latest version of the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the goals is to end extreme poverty on a global basis. And actually that one might get accomplished. I mean, I think COVID is a complication. Whether we're about to go into a big global recession, that's another complication. But, it's easy to imagine that in our lifetimes, that there won't be extremely poor people anymore. There'll still be a range. There'll still be people that are a lot poorer than other people, for sure. But this idea of extreme poverty, where your only choice is to have to get your own natural resources to support you and your family, and you can't afford medicine and you can't afford education, that state is going away.
Yeah, and you mentioned maybe it's just worth mentioning the COVID blip on that curve. As far as I understand, the reduction in poverty has been fairly consistent since the 1990s, and it was in 2020 when that changed. But even now, things are starting to get back to the good trend, right? The poverty reduction trend. So COVID did set us back by a few years, perhaps, or by some time, but we're kind of getting back on track already now. Is that more or less correct?
That's my understanding as well. It's also important, Andre, to note that it's both rural and urban poverty that are changing and going down on a global scale. Because those are two really different kinds of poverty. People that live in rural situations, at least maybe they have some kind of land base to pull on. People in cities, cities work on a kind of cash economy. And so if they're poor there, it's really, really difficult. And, that pushes people into, really, really difficult kinds of choices.
Because there's no substitute for money, basically, in there.
That's right.
And then, so we've spoken about population growth and poverty. And I guess with population growth, it's pretty obvious what the benefits are to the environment and biodiversity if human population decreases. But you quite rightly pointed out that we should talk about how the reduction of poverty impacts on the environment as well. And I think that, the general assumption, and what I used to be pretty convinced of myself, was that the more wealthy people are, the worse it is for the environment, because people tend to consume more. But that's not the whole picture, is it?
No, not at all. Not at all. And again, I think it sort of depends on where you are and the amount of income and wealth that you have, the kind of decisions you make. But I think the reason why Joe Walston and John Robinson and I focused on extreme poverty in our essay is because if you're extremely poor, you really have no choices, right? I mean, I think that's the true tragedy of the thing is, you're facing your child dying or your spouse dying, unless you get water or unless you cut down the forest around you to have, fuel to cook your food and to keep you warm. You just have no choices at all. Once you've moved away from extreme poverty into other kinds of poverty, or even hopefully middle class wealth, and the middle class has also been growing around the world. Now you have choices to make, and so it is true you may consume more because you have more money, but you also have the choice not to consume. as much. You have a choice to make. And I think that's why it's so critical.
Mm-hmm.
I really think ultimately this is about how we come to make choices as a society, as a global society. And it's important to open up that space of choice, that space to actually make decisions about your life and your life in the context of what it means to the lives of other people, what it means in the context of lives for biodiversity, and what it means in the context for the future.
So the general trend, as far as I understand, is that it's called the environmental Kuznets curve, right?
That's right.
Where people, as they become wealthier, for a while, their impact on the environment increases, but then it goes down. This is the per capita impact on the environment. As it goes down, the size of families is also decreasing, which sort of compounds that effect.
Yeah, that's what we're sort of talking about. Although I will say, there's a lot of debate around the environmental Kuznets curve and what is the sort of appropriate level of analysis, and it probably is different depending on the commodity and the details of the socioeconomic situation and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, that's the idea. I mean, I and I think it makes sense. There's no individual on Earth, no biological thing that doesn't impact other aspects of the environment in some shape or form, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in human society, it really is around income in the modern economy that is the sort of way that your impacts are felt. But I don't think it's a straight line either to all levels of income, all levels of wealth and income. I think what actually is more likely is that when you're very, very poor, if you get a little bit more income, you spend it to improve your material lifestyle. And I think you probably should. You get more food, you get better water, you get better housing. And I think that's completely appropriate and right and even just. I think that is a world that we should be working toward and trying to encourage.
Right.
As your income increases and you're sort of more middle income, then you start making choices. I don't know, do I eat more meat, or do I buy a television, or do I go to a show, or do I give to a conservation organization? And as you get even wealthier, what happens is, you can't spend all that money. I mean, there are all these kind of egregious cases, and I think this goes back to the sort of psychological state we're living in of people having, 10 houses and, the ways the plutocrats of the world live, which is in the news all the time. And so we're always doing this comparison with each other. But I think actually, what wealthy people, and, I would put myself in this category, not super wealthy, but, of comfortable levels of wealth, what you do is you invest, you put that money in the market, or you do something to defer it, you put it in your 401k for your retirement, you're not actually spending it right now on more resources. It's sort of this kind of delayed consumption sort of thing. And also, passing on that wealth to future generations, to your kids and to your great grandkids. And so in some sense, we've created this world where we've very efficiently taken the natural capital of the world, the natural resources of the world, and we've converted them into these monetary forms of capital that are unevenly distributed. And now the question is, what do we do with those things, with that monetary capital, which is in some sense all just made up in our heads, right? Like, nature doesn't know anything about yens or dollars or, whatever currency. It's just our willing to recognize that if I give you this much money, you'll give me back something that I want. Right. And then we have this negotiation around price. So this is where the sort of economic side of it comes in. And what are we going to do? This great acceleration has turned so much natural resources into financial resources. What are we going to do with those financial resources as a society, as a global collective?
Yeah. Back to the list, and to finish off those three global trends, and the one which really the paper focuses on, and which I think brings things together here, the population growth, the end of population growth and the end of poverty are kind of, they lay the foundation to this to some extent. But the third one is the growth of cities. Why could more and bigger cities help conservation? Because this is, I think, to some people quite counterintuitive.
Yes. So I think urbanization is really the key that unlocks everything here. And I'll distinguish a little bit in your question the difference between more cities and bigger cities, because those are two different kinds of questions which we can get to.
Sure.
But the point is that one of the trends of the Great Acceleration is rapid urbanization all around the world. It's often taken as just another one of these sort of socioeconomic trends. Like, again, if you look at Will Steffen's papers on the Great Acceleration, you'll see there's, the growth of the world population, then there's the growth of the urban population. And a lot of economics, it's sort of treated the same way. It's just sort of another factor that's sort of in this cluster around globalization and economic convergence and so forth.
Mm.
What Joe and John and I sort of argue in our paper is that it's more than that. It's actually the driver of the other sorts of things, and in separate but related ways. So people all around the world are moving to cities. Some of that is because they're want to, because of economic opportunity largely. Other times it's because they're being pushed to, because, for various policies that are pushing them off of their land, their rural. And often those two things are sort of working in concert in terms of individual people's decision making. And why is that? It's because cities are just so economically productive. It turns out when you put people together, it allows us to communicate with each other, to have new ideas. And more importantly, I think it allows us to find occupations that are best suited to our individual capacities. My family, my grandfather was a farmer, and his father was a farmer, and his father was a farmer. In fact, as far as I know, they were all farmers, but I would have been a terrible, terrible farmer. I'm really bad at doing physical things. I'm very poor with my hands unless I'm typing on a keyboard. It would have been a very poor occupation to me. I would have been a poor farmer, but I feel like I'm an okay scholar. And the only reason I can do that is because I work in a city, right? Because cities provide this vast array of different kinds of occupations for different people. And so, and the capacity to actually move between them. Cities are just such this remarkable thing, even like during the plague in Europe in the, 14th century, people were still moving to cities because, if you wanted to do something besides agriculture with your life, that was really the only mechanism. And it creates enormous economic power. That economic power is not distributed evenly. That's a big, inequity in cities is a big issue and has been for a long time. And it's something that can be and should be addressed. But it creates a lot of economic power, and then that draws more people in and makes the cities grow faster. And that is the underlying piece of in my view, of the growth in the real GDP that we talked about earlier, of the Great Acceleration. It's also, I think, really important to demographic futures. So if you dig into what is the factors that lead people to have fewer kids, it's a lot about women's rights. It's access to contraception and family planning and this sort of thing. But those things are then played into, the economic decisions that women are allowed to make. The most important decision about how many children a woman has over the course of their lifetime is the time of her first reproduction, the time their first child is born. You tend to have a child early in life as a teenager in your early 20s, you'll tend to have more children. If you tend to have your first child in your late 20s, your 30s, you tend to have fewer children. And this phenomena seems to be a global one. Despite, lots of different parts of society pushing women basically to have more children, they don't really work if you have good cities happening. In our paper, we plot these graphs against urbanization, the death rate, the birth rate, the education rate. The education just goes like this, the other way. The economic education, economics goes up. Poverty declines, even though there's terrible urban poverty. The rates are declining, and they decline faster than they do in rural areas because of this economic productivity. So good cities, and there are a lot of examples of bad cities, so I don't want to whitewash that sort of thing. But good cities with good urban governance that are really trying to invest in their people, I think are such an important part of the long-term environmental solution. The last thing about cities relates to the consumption piece. So you would think, well, there's all these opportunities, there's all these cool things to spend on. Urban people much consume more. But to the extent that we have research on this, even if you adjust for income, urban people consume less than a rural person at the same level of income. So if I don't know, if I make $100,000 a year and I live in a city and I live in, some rural part of the country, I will consume more natural resources if I live in the rural places. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is it just requires more infrastructure to get the stuff to you, and you have to drive more and you have to get around because now you're so spread apart. To go to the grocery store, you have to drive 20 minutes. Whereas, I can walk in 5 minutes to the grocery store where I live here in the Bronx. I can just go around the corner and go to the bodega. Also, people in cities, because real estate is more expensive, because it's more valuable, tend to live in smaller spaces, and they live in shared structures that share walls. They share transportation solutions, subways and trains and and buses and this sort of thing. And all of these act to drive down the per capita rates of consumption. So I think in the long run, that's kind of the world we're heading to. The world I think that we could see by the end of the century is a world of 8 to 10 billion people, 7 to 9 billion people, something like that, 80% of which live in towns and cities, who are connected to each other in some sort of globalized economy, but who, through their ability to ideate, their ability to make ideas, their ability to talk to each other, come to a consensus around a sustainable path for the planet. Not because they've given up a lot, but because they've chosen conditions that are best for their lives, that are also the best lives for the planet.
There is an argument, though, that because cities, or at least there's a correlation between cities and wealth, and whether that's causal or not, people are likely to spend more and consume more. So all the efficiencies that you've mentioned, I get what you say there, but at the same time, there is this greater wealth in cities, which does give people the power to buy more and to spend more. So I guess for a given salary, it's very clear, based on what you've just said, why someone in a city would be lighter on the environment than someone in a rural area. But that's not really usually the comparison, right? Because most people in cities are more wealthy than most people in rural areas. So can you say something about that? Like, how do you square that? Or have I got it wrong?
Well, I think one piece it's important to recognize is that you have more options for your spending when you have more income and in cities, right? So, perhaps you give your money to a conservation organization, or perhaps you go to a musical performance as opposed to, some other thing. Maybe you buy more services than you do goods because your basic goods are met, because your requirements are less because of living in cities. It's also true that cities are more expensive. So yes, you have, maybe you have more income, maybe you have more wealth, but it's also more expensive because there is a premium to bring those resources in, which is, why I think that's one of those things that we kind of need to lean into in conservation, which is the more that we can build in prices on natural resources and on pollution, then the more that gets taken into account in the economic system. And that will also be a motivator toward lowering consumption. And that goes back to the sort of larger argument we're trying to make in the bottleneck and the breakthrough paper is, okay, so there are these factors that are largely driven by urbanization that are shaping the population trajectory. There are factors that are shaping the consumption trajectory about the end of poverty, but also are connected to urbanization and the kinds of things we're just getting into now, the kind of choices that people make. If we can get both those numbers going down at the same time, on a global scale, then the overall impact on nature will also go down, right? So that is sort of the core of the argument, is that urbanization can work on both those sides, the population side and the consumption side.
Right.
But it doesn't all happen at once. You have to put it in historical context and you have to put it in geographic context, right? So we are, right now here in 2022, we're living in a period where the population is still growing and the consumption is still going up. Right. And that's creating more and more pressure on nature writ large. Right. Measured by all those things that Stefan talks about in his papers and many more factors, and including our individual experiences. I mean, just, imagine this situation where you grew up and what it was like when you're a kid and what it's like now if you were to go back to the same place. And we all have sort of seen conversion of a woodlot or a wetland, into housing or something, to some other form that serves human beings and doesn't serve nature as much. So that's the bottleneck. That's the pressures. And in the best case, that those increasing pressures, that sort of extremity of pressures are going to increase for another, 3 or 4 decades, right? Into the 2060s, into the 2070s. That's the best case situation. But then eventually we'll get to a point, in the best case situation, say by the end of the century, where the pressures start to let off. The global population is stabilized and consumption is stabilized. And now we have an operating space where nature can reassert itself and provide more back to human society and to itself, to its own, its own factors, its own sort of desires and principles that don't have anything to do with us. In the worst case scenario, maybe that doesn't happen. The bottleneck closes so much that we see a collapse of the global ecosystem, which would not be good for nature and would not be good for human beings as part of that nature.
So as you say in the paper, what's key is that we can get through that bottleneck and to the breakthrough point. And the question is whether we will be able to get there, without systems collapsing, right? That's kind of the big question mark.
That's the key thing. That's the key thing. And that's why I think conservation is just the most important thing any of us can do at this point in time. To help those little packets of nature get through the bottleneck, So which is why, I'm a big believer in protected areas, because I think protected areas are, if they're properly managed and well-funded, all they are is saying that in this geographic space, this part of the ocean or this part of the land, certain human activities are not going to be allowed because they are detrimental to the nature of that place. That's all it says. Mm-hmm. And I know protected areas are controversial in certain quarters, but I just think that they're the most efficient way to get some elements of nature through the bottleneck. And by protected areas, I mean, also working with indigenous people and other kinds of conservation areas and so forth. But, protecting land, protecting the water through this period is just so critical. We may not need them so much 100 years from now, but we really need them now. And so I think we need to invest in them. Mm-hmm. The second thing we need to do is, if we're going to accept a world that's based on economic decisions and the marketplace of commodities, then the things that matter the most need to be represented in terms of the prices. And that's natural resources on the one hand and pollution on the other. So things like carbon taxes are just, I just think that's the best and most efficient way for everybody involved, to send the economy the signals it needs so that it tries to drive down consumption. Probably in combination with some sort of social leveling, right? So that some people can't buy their ways out of the taxation. I mean, I think that's an important part, but I think that part is really about social justice and social aspects of it, not so much about the natural aspects. And all nature really cares about is the total consumption, not who's doing the consumption, right? And the total population, not who is composed in the total population. And then the third factor, I think, is to make good cities, to make sustainable cities that are sustainable for the people that are living there, sustainable for the nature, trying to decrease the impact, doing all the, the really creative things that people are doing in terms of making cities, less impactful on nature. At the same time, accentuating the positives. They need to be safe places. They need to be creative places. They need to be democratic places. And then, that is how we get through. I think that's the recipe for how we get to the breakthrough. And why, the decisions that you and I and people alive today are so critical to making. We're deciding whether this is going to be a 3-decade crisis or a 10-decade crisis. And I think that's what we really need to say to conservationists is, to carry on the good work, but to take this sort of large historical perspective and see how your work fits into history and just how important it is.
Mm-hmm. Eric, this is going back a little bit to something that you said earlier on, and it's more of a demographic question than a conservation-related question, but I was just curious if you have any thoughts on it. It's something which I have wondered on and off over the years. In South Africa, where I'm from, there's, as in most parts of the world, there's been a fairly constant migration of people from rural areas into cities. And in most cases, they're moving into pretty poverty-stricken situations. I mean, this is probably in most cases not at the level of extreme poverty that we've been talking about, but still pretty severe poverty. And yet they keep moving from the rural areas to the urban areas. And I used to wonder why they did that. And the only two explanations I can come up with are, A, it really is better in the cities than, even in those conditions, it's better than it is in the rural areas, which is, there's plenty of evidence behind that, but I still struggle a little bit with that one. The other possibility is that they think it's going to be better and that there's this sort of promise of what's possible in the city. And certainly there is a lot more opportunity. You alluded to that earlier on. But for a lot of those people, they might spend their entire lives in those shanty towns. And I kind of wonder, would they have been better off staying in the rural areas? Do you have any thoughts on that, sort of why people do move and whether it is sort of a disillusioned decision or if it's a well-informed decision in most cases?
Yeah, well, I have two things to say about that. Mm-hmm. One is I think people are thinking not just about themselves in this case, but about their kids.
Sure.
So the one place where human beings are really good about thinking about the future is thinking about their kids. And so I think some people are making the trade-off. They're poor in a rural area.
Mm-hmm.
They're moving to, a terrible situation in some of these slums and favelas and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But they're doing it because their kids might have a better chance, because they can get some schooling and then get out of the trap that they're in. I think there's one part like that. But the other thing I wanted to say, Andre, is that these slums and favelas don't have to be. They're not an inevitable consequence of urbanization. They're actually a failure of urban planning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cities have been typically managed for the people that are in them, not thinking about what they're going to do when they grow. And yet they keep growing. And it's very clear that they are going to grow. And it turns out that it's so much easier to plan for growth proactively than it is to sort of retroactively do it. A lot of these slums and shanties and so forth are because there isn't land tenure, because there isn't a place for people to own their own homes, right? So they're living in these marginal areas, like on cliff sides or in, awful valley bottoms and things, because that's the only
dangerous
places. Yeah. And, places probably people shouldn't live for the environmental reasons, but also shouldn't be living for kind of social reasons. They're also hard to manage, and crime and all these other things can come into play. So the real solution is to plan ahead. I don't know, which city you're thinking of, but just take that city and imagine that, it's going to be twice as big as it was, when you were growing up in it. And that means that those rural areas on its periphery, you need to plan ahead for them to be converted to housing. And, and if you plan ahead, well, then you can make parks, right? You can figure out where the roads are going to go. You can plan a subway system or a tram system or something like that. In conservation, we never talk to urban planners, but urban planners hold so many levers of power in terms of creating a better world.
Yeah.
And then the planning community needs to be empowered by the political community. I mean, we're facing this here in New York City, where I live. You would think, after all these years, New York City was the first mega city on the face of the planet, the first city of 10 million people or more in 1950. And you would think we would know, but, in the last 10 years, over 600,000 people have moved to New York City, and it's driving this enormous affordable housing crisis at the moment. And that's spilling over into, recent crime wave and, issues with the pandemic and things. And we're still just not capable, or, the sort of political system is not capable of taking the ideas that exist in the sort of planning system and in the science to be able to make a better city that, could accommodate the population.
It's quite a challenge, though, because the city that I'm thinking of is Cape Town, which is where I'm from. So it's unusual in the sense that it's very biodiverse, and a lot of the surroundings are still relatively pristine. So this is a bit of an extreme example, but I think that in the case of many cities, even if the analysts tell you that, with 99.9% certainty, this place is going to double in size in the next 20 or 30 years, whether you like it or not, even in a case like that, I think it's very difficult for people to accept, especially the conservationists, that they're going to have to convert nature in the immediate vicinity of the city. And I guess that's really a big part of it. How do you accept that? And of course there are efficiencies to take advantage of, for example, brownfield sites and parts of cities which really are kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of converting them into residential areas or whatever. But if you know that your city is going to double in size, that there's some huge sacrifices that have to be made in the short term and in the immediate vicinity as far as biodiversity is concerned. And I guess that's a tricky decision to make.
Yeah, that's right. But I also think I completely agree with you. And that's where proactive planning, comes in. But I also think, we tend to manage our cities as individual units. Like what happens in Cape Town doesn't have anything to do with what happens in Johannesburg. But in fact, it does have something to do with it. And I don't know South Africa at all, but, all the other smaller secondary cities too, and tertiary cities. That's what I meant earlier when I said, it's a little bit different than this idea more and bigger. It tends to be that the biggest cities tend to win the most. But I think actually one of the solutions is to raise up the second and tertiary cities and help them grow a little bit more. Where I live in New York State, we have these cities that were just rocking in the 19th century and are kind of failing now, places like Utica or Rome, New York, or Syracuse, and, in some dimensions, or Rochester, these old industrial cities with a lot of housing stock and a real need for economic life.
Mm-hmm.
So, I say this to people in New York City always sort of grimace at me, but, not everybody has to live in Brooklyn. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how we choose or why we get to choose, but I think somehow, the state government needs to have, some set of incentive structures so that not everybody feels like the only way to live is to live in Brooklyn. But actually you could have a good life if you lived in Utica, or you could live a good life if you lived in Rome,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe even people can move. Maybe people will eventually move from Brooklyn, especially with sea level rise, and Rome will be the next place to live, Rome, New York, not Rome, Italy. Just to say that, we tend to think of these things as individual pieces when they're actually all part of a big system, a
Mm-hmm.
system of decisions. And government has an important role to play in terms of the kind of incentive structures and the kind of nudges that it gives to people. I'm not talking about control. I'm just talking about nudging in certain
Mm-hmm.
directions that are better for society at large and better for, the society of nature as well.
Mm-hmm. This is somewhat unrelated, but you have written a book about the nature of New York City. The city interests me, and I was just curious about the book. Could you kind of explain what it's all about, what it encompasses, and what was your goal in writing it?
Yeah, well, sure. So I also moved to a city, for a job, just like what I've been talking about. But, 24 years ago, I moved from suburban existence in California and took this wonderful job at the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York. And my job, I'm trained originally as an ecosystem and landscape ecologist. And my job was to, go around the world and help our field projects in 60 countries around the world to use landscape ecology to better understand their place and do better conservation there. And one of the things I observed about those people is they all had places that they knew so much. Many of my colleagues work in a place for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, and they just know it at this amazing level of depth. You can sort of ask them any question. And I kept, flying to Africa or flying to Asia and then flying back to New York City. And as I would look out in the plane, I would just, that idea about, I wonder what this place was like, this place where I'm living is. And I wonder what more we can learn about it. Eventually morphed into this project that we called the Manhattan Project. After, the famous Manhattan Project that started here in New York, which was to build the atomic bomb. Our idea with the Manhattan Project is to blow up this idea that cities and nature don't have anything to do with each other. And to do it by trying to describe to the best level of detail that we could what the original ecology of Manhattan was like. And now we're actually doing all 5 boroughs of New York City. And the key there was a series of 18th century maps from the American Revolution when the Americans were fighting the British for the fate of the country, and New York City was the British headquarters. And there were these extraordinary military cartographers working for the British Army at the time, and they made this one map that's 10 feet long and sort of 3 feet wide at an amazing scale that shows all the streams and the hills and the wetlands of Manhattan Island. At the time, the entire town of New York was just up to kind of where City Hall Park is. It's like a 20-minute walk from the Battery, at the very tip of Manhattan, up to where the park is. And then after that, it was just all rural countryside. And they needed it for military reasons to figure out where the cannon go or where to put the infantry and so forth. But I saw it as an ecological map, like if I knew where the streams were, I knew where the hills were, I knew where the shoreline was, I knew where the beaches were, that, I could add in other information and reconstruct the ecology of the island. And it started out as an idea and kind of a hobby, and then became kind of an obsession. I started studying, the extraordinary natural history of this place. And, New York is it's really an archipelago of islands in a really productive estuary, arguably the best estuary on the east coast of the United States. This enormous river, the Hudson River coming down, the, really fertile Atlantic Ocean right there. All these kind of interdigitated ecosystems, wetlands, of all kinds, salt marshes, various kinds of salt marshes, brackish marshes, all these just sort of freshwater wetland. It's on the Atlantic flyway for birds. Anyway, all of these different factors sort of came together. And a long history of indigenous inhabitation. The Lenape people have been here, they or earlier cultures have been here for 8,000 years. And, much longer than the modern European derivation of New York City. So anyway, I put all this together, first in a series of maps and databases and things. And then eventually I I worked with a friend of mine, Mark Boyer, to reconstruct images of what it used to look like from specific geographic positions. You can take a picture out of the Empire State Building and reconstruct what that view would have been like, a couple hours before Henry Hudson showed up in September of 1609. And then use that to both talk about how the places, change, but also where might it go in the future? What lessons can we learn out of the natural history that would inform the modern social, economic, political history of the city going forward? It really changed my mind about urbanization. Obviously there's been enormous damage in terms of the actual ecosystems here, but at the same time, it's not like it's completely devoid of nature. I mean, we still have migratory birds that come through. Central Park is one of the best bird watching places in the country, because in the spring you can see so many birds in such a short period of time, because that is the green space that they have available to them. Or we have all these natural areas in our park system. 10,000 acres of natural areas that were the places that were going to be a ball field or were going to be a soccer field, and just never got converted. And so now they're still forests and they're still wetlands and they're still doing their ecosystem service lanes. And they're still really important to people, So in some sense, on the one hand, it's this really cool historical story and this thing that's not really told in New York City's history. And it turns out it's really cool and so interesting. So it's also sort of kind of lessons about ecosystem ecology and landscape ecology and how landscapes are put together and how nature is a big network of interactions, which is so cool and has these really important analogies to the way cities work. But also this third idea that to place in the minds of my, friends and neighbors, the idea that New York City couldn't exist except for nature. And therefore New York City has an obligation to nature, not just nature within its bounds, but nature writ large, to create a world that we all can live in. Yeah, that experience is really, deep inside of my thinking.
Okay, so that's it for this month's podcast. But if you're interested in more city-related conservation discussion, check out episode 6 of the podcast with Deborah Roberts and episode 14 with Vidar Narvelo and Grant Pearsall. Next month's episode is not yet tied down, but 2 possible topics for discussion, depending on guest availability, are biodiversity offsets and the goods and evils of private sector support for conservation and the environment. I hope you can join us.